They wanted my keys in front of 100 people. They wanted me to hand over my home like a coat at the door. I remember the pause that followed, the small, amused silence that comes when people think they've just witnessed something charming. There was laughter, light, polite laughter that floats without landing anywhere. I stood still, holding the keys in my palm, the metal pressing into the soft skin between my fingers. The sound of them clinking together was sharper than I expected. It reminded me of every door I had locked, every hinge I had oiled, every window I had measured and fixed. They wanted the keys, as if they were asking for a cup of sugar. I read the post twice. Her words were light, precise, and meant to be funny. My daughter-in-law had written that my mother-in-law doesn't do anything, and then added that it's her job to take care of the house and kids. The phrasing was clever, the tone breezy. Everyone laughed in the comments and praised her honesty. They called her relatable and refreshing. Someone even wrote, "Every family has one." I closed the app and smiled the way you smile at a bandaged hand, polite and patient. The smile lasted long enough for me to put my phone in my pocket and open the little spiral notebook I carry. I begin to count. Counting steadies me. I write it down in the notebook I keep in my coat pocket. I have a bad knee and a better memory. I have learned that memory, like wood, warps if you don't keep it dry. The phone buzzed like a trapped insect on the table. I left it there. Neighbors heard everything and the building smelled of fried onions. The hallway light flickered every few seconds, making everything look like a scene rehearsing itself. I am careful with words and carefuler with timing. A man who has worked with his hands knows how to time pressure. You push too early, the nail bends. Too late, and it splits the wood. I learned to watch light the way a carpenter watches grain. My hands remember work. My mind refuses to forget. There is no grand plan, only the slow tilt of consequence. That's what people never understand. They imagine retribution as something loud and theatrical, but the truth is quieter. It's a long correction, like a floor settling. I stop running after them and let consequences run after me. People who profit from other people's labor rarely notice when labor stops. The city is a set of small scripts, and I break one line at a time. My notebook becomes a ledger, a map of favors and refusals. I do nothing suddenly, and the world does something to itself. "You want the keys," I said, "and you want an explanation." I begin with small things. I stop bringing soup on Wednesday. I stop answering for late-night plumbing calls. I stop taking the kids to the corner playground. Those were the gestures that made them think I was part of the background scenery. Withdraw the background and the picture changes. It doesn't collapse, it reveals. You start to see what was depending on what. The first week without my soup, they ordered takeout and posted photos. The second week, they forgot to mention dinner at all. By the third, there were complaints about money, fatigue, and the price of childcare. I didn't comment. I let the comments feed themselves. When they asked for proofs of care, I supplied receipts. Receipts for paint and caulking I had bought for a condo none of them thought to maintain. I kept a dated record of nights I had sat up because of a fever and mornings I had fixed a stuck door. The spiral notebook filled with neat sentences in ink, dates, times, short notes. Fixed sink, June 3rd. Picked up Ella, June 12th. Paid parking, July 2nd. The list looked like an inventory of things they had appropriated without credit. Each line was a nail driven into the quiet wall of my patience. People like to say care is invisible. It is invisible only to those who never look. It is a small thing to be forgotten in your own house. It is another thing to be used in the script of someone else's life. When that script gets posted and applauded, it becomes permanent. That is when I decided that silence would be my first answer. Silence is a hammer that works slowly. It does not shout. It waits. I am older than the people who want my explanation, and I have patience. I write "start counting" in my notebook and close it. The next morning, I sit by the kitchen window with a cup of tea. The light is different in October, thinner, like it has been stretched. I watch the street below, delivery trucks, joggers, a woman pulling a child by the hand. I make notes about the rhythm of the neighborhood. I spend a week watching and noting small details. Which tenants water their plants every morning? Which windows stay dark past 11? Which owners hang laundry on Sunday? Observation becomes a form of prayer. I smell the city the way a painter checks a room's light before starting. The detail is where the truth hides. The young people live in rooms that have been curated for social media. Everything is placed for effect. They have learned to extract sympathy and applause as if those were services to be billed. In their pictures, even exhaustion has a filter. A sink full of dishes becomes real life. A tired face becomes authenticity. I see how language works for them, how it polishes grievance into entertainment. They call it honesty, but it is performance. My silence, in contrast, has no audience. It is not content, it is consequence. I stop going to family dinners that have a pattern. I send text messages that are non-committal. Maybe next week, I write, feeling tired. I let their appliances clog and remain unplugged. The first week, Dan calls and asks if I'm ill. I tell him I'm fine. It's better this way, I say. Let the dust settle. He hears the words I've been saying my whole life, words that refuse melodrama. He hears them like a tariff. A neighbor, Anya, mentions the post in the laundry room like she is relaying a weather report. Did you see what Cass wrote? She was funny. Anya's voice has the curious lift of someone who watches gossip like morning television. I nod and say nothing. My silence is a tool. Silence leaves room for others to reveal themselves. She keeps talking, mistaking quiet for agreement. You must be proud of her. She has a real way with words. I fold my laundry carefully, one piece at a time. The rhythm of folding is something that has never failed me. Order, in small things, prevents chaos in the mind. I thank her and leave. She watches me go, trying to read my expression, but there's nothing to read. People forget that stillness can be deliberate. The days stretch quietly. I start to clean my apartment with a precision I haven't had in years. Every shelf, every corner. I oil the hinges of my own doors. I take my time. I find things that have waited for attention. A chipped plate, an old photograph of Dan as a boy with a crooked smile and scraped knees. I stare at it longer than I should. He used to sit beside me while I repaired furniture, asking questions about how things fit together. I remember explaining that every piece of wood had a direction, that even nails preferred certain angles. He nodded like he understood. Years later, when he married, he told me he admired how I made things work. He didn't realize that what he admired was labor disguised as love. At the hardware store, I start taking more shifts. The owner, an old friend named Matteo, knows me well enough not to ask too many questions. He hands me work orders, and I do them without talking much. The store smells like wood and cleaning product. The light hums in the ceiling. Customers come and go, asking about screws, handles, wiring. I measure tools the same way I measure people, by what they do when nothing is demanded of them. A man comes in one afternoon asking for advice on fixing a broken latch. He says his wife wants it done before the weekend. I show him the right kind of screwdriver, the right size of screw. He thanks me absently and rushes out. I wonder if he'll get credit for the work, or if the latch will be forgotten by Sunday. In the evenings, I sit on my balcony and write. The notebook is nearly full, but I keep adding lines. The act of writing steadies the world. I list what I notice. Mailbox uncollected, apt 3B. Noise complaint filed, 7:45 p.m. Light in stairwell fixed. The notebook has become more than a record. It is evidence of being present. When I read back through it, I can trace my own patience like a thread. The city outside keeps moving, indifferent to the quiet revolutions taking place inside people's hearts. I think of Cass's post sometimes. I imagine her scrolling through likes and laughing with friends. I don't resent her laughter. I resent the ease with which she forgets that laughter has a cost. I've learned that care, when unacknowledged, curdles into something else, something brittle and exacting. But I do not want revenge. I want equilibrium. There is a difference. Equilibrium requires withdrawal, not attack. I withdraw piece by piece, gesture by gesture, until the absence begins to hum. They will feel it the way you feel the missing note in a song you thought you knew by heart. When the kids ask why I don't visit, I tell them, "You'll understand one day. They are too young to understand patience, but they understand waiting. Waiting is a kind of teaching." The second month, Cass sends a message. "We miss you. Dan's been worried." The words are polite, almost formal. I reply with a single line. "I'm fine. Take care." No warmth, no hostility, just the even tone of someone who has learned to conserve energy. She doesn't reply. I imagine her reading it twice, the way I once read her post. Maybe she wonders what I mean. Maybe she doesn't. I've stopped needing to know. Winter comes early that year. The radiator clicks like a metronome. Snow gathers in the corners of the window frame. I keep my curtains open. I like the reflection of street lights on the frost. It reminds me of old workshop nights when I would stay up repairing cabinets, the smell of varnish heavy in the air. Back then, work was a way of speaking without words. Every tightened screw, every smooth joint said, "I'm still here." Now my silence says the same thing, only slower. One evening, Matteo asks if I'd like to help with a small renovation job in the neighborhood. Painting, replacing trim, simple work. I accept. The apartment belongs to a retired teacher. She pays in cash and makes tea for the workers. We talk about weather, books, the sound old buildings make when they settle. She tells me she lives alone but doesn't mind it. "Peace has a sound," she says, "if you listen long enough." I think about that sentence for days. Peace has a sound, the absence of demand, the steady rhythm of your own breathing. When I pass by Dan and Cass's building now, I no longer feel the pull of habit. I nod to the doorman, who looks surprised to see me. The elevator door opens, and I imagine the sound of children's voices somewhere above. I do not go up. Instead, I keep walking. I tell myself this is what distance feels like when it's earned. It is not loneliness. It's space reclaimed. The city keeps teaching me. Every gesture has weight, every silence a contour. When people stop expecting you to explain yourself, they begin to notice what your absence rearranges. I've seen it happen. Dan's messages grow shorter, less certain. "How are you?" "Hope you're well." The punctuation changes. The pauses between words lengthen. The performance collapses quietly. In time, I know they will understand. Not all at once, not through apology, but through the slow realization that convenience is not inheritance. A home is not a service. It's an agreement, renewed through respect. I no longer wait for their understanding. I count my steps, my receipts, my days. Each line in the notebook is a sentence in a story that doesn't need to be posted or liked. It is enough that it exists. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine unlocking the door again, stepping inside as if nothing happened. But the thought passes. The act of restraint feels stronger than any return. The keys remain where they belong. In my hand, cool and heavy, a reminder that not everything needs to be handed over. I turn them once, just to hear the sound. It is the sound of something closed properly, something kept. And that, I think, is enough. Before we continue, hit the hype button, subscribe, and like the video to help the channel grow. Tell us which city you are from in the comments. We'd love to get to know our audience better. Counting starts like a game. It becomes a ledger. It begins as a way to steady the mind, to make sense of a slow accumulation of small insults that would otherwise dissolve into air. Counting gives them shape. It gives silence weight. I stop doing things and watch what happens. That's the rule. No announcement, no confrontation, only subtraction. Remove the gesture and wait for the reaction. I stop answering calls that ask me to babysit. I stop showing up to patch a faucet or check the pipes when the shower runs cold. I do not text in the evenings to say, on my way, when errands call. The condo's balcony plants die slowly, their leaves curling in on themselves, small and yellow. The stack of mail grows in the entryway like an accusation. The lights stay on in certain rooms because people will not remember to turn them out. I do not remind them. I let the inefficiencies accumulate, quiet and deliberate. By the beginning of the second week, a fine arrives in Dan's inbox. It's from the HOA, stern and legal in tone, complaining about trash in a shared hallway and an unreported pet. I imagine the letterhead, the blocky paragraphs, the official seal at the top. It is a document written by people who believe order comes from paper. Cass forwards the notice to me with the comment, "Please fix this." The request is bold because the logic it rides on is older than the formatting. My labor is assumed, unpaid and available. For years, I have been the silent infrastructure of their life, the one who makes things run without notice. When she writes, "Please fix this," what she means is, do what you've always done so I can continue believing it happens by itself. I reply, "Send keys." She replies back with a string of laughing emojis and a threat to block me if I continue to be difficult. The exchange sits under the throb of the apartment's air conditioner like a bruise, visible only if you know where to look. A pattern emerges. People who demand access assume you will provide it. The access can be literal, like keys, or social, like a reputation you maintain through unpaid labor. Remove access, and the people who depended on it must scramble or explain. They prefer scrambling to explaining. Scrambling preserves pride. Explanation exposes debt. I've lived long enough to see how the smallest withdrawal of effort rearranges an entire household. It's not the grand acts that shift the balance, it's the pauses. You stop showing up and the walls start to whisper. A hinge squeaks, a door jams, a schedule collapses. What was invisible becomes structural. Coach Walt sees me at the gym and nods. "You're not going soft on them," he says. He is a big man who keeps small hours and a watchful eye. The gym smells like iron and dust and disinfectant. "You do something, do it true," he says. His voice has the certainty of a man who has lived by repetition. I lift and my knee complains, but I keep count. I breathe, count, and go again. The work is physical, but the plan is mental. Strength matters, but timing matters more. The rhythm of weights and breath mirrors the rhythm of restraint. I tell Walt I'm working on something long-term. He grins, thinking I mean a fitness goal. I let him think that. Some truths don't need to be shared. At home, I sharpen pencils and copy my notes neatly into a second notebook. The first one is a field log, rough and immediate. The second is deliberate, almost formal. I write the dates and events like a record keeper. April 10th, repaired stairwell light. April 15th, bought groceries, left them on porch. May 2nd, picked up Ella after daycare, paid cab. Each line is factual, restrained. It's not anger that fills the pages, but proof. The list reads like evidence to a jury of indifferent things. In the margin, I note small reactions. No thanks, no text back, post followed next day. These are the correlates of silence. I have learned that if you record carefully enough, indifference reveals its pattern. People think of revenge as loud and spectacular. They picture a sudden explosion of accusation, a shouting match in a kitchen, or a slammed door that echoes down the hall. That is not how I intend to proceed. I intend to be meticulous and patient. My revenge is a machine whose gears are receipts, witnesses, and timing. I will not shout. I will let truth show itself under the bright lights the way a carpenter lets a joint reveal its fit. You don't need to force wood to tell you its grain. You just need to watch how it splits. The same is true of people. You give them enough space, and they expose the fault lines themselves. Cass's posts continue, each one a small stone tossed into a pool. My mother-in-law doesn't do anything, she writes in another one. Her followers post heart emojis and comments of support. They call her brave, funny, real. She frames me in language that makes me an absence that must be filled. In the mind of a social media audience, absence can be curated into narrative. An evil mother, a lazy elder, an obstacle to marriage. They don't see me. They see a character built from pixels and punchlines. I've become part of her content calendar. My silence is her material. I start to understand that the modern version of erasure isn't forgetting, it's performance. Dan texts, "Dad, it's getting ugly. Just hand over the keys. It'll smooth things." His message arrives in the middle of the day while I'm sanding a piece of pine in the workshop. The dust coats my hands like fine snow. I wipe them on my jeans and stare at the phone. The word smooth catches my eye. Smooth for whom? Smoothness is the comfort of those who've never worked with rough surfaces. I type 2 words and send them. No. It is a small rebellion. It feels like a switch flipped in a quiet room. The refusal echoes louder than any argument could. The next morning, I find the mail slot half blocked by flyers. A bright card sticks out. Community support for Cass and Dan, printed in cheerful blue letters. Inside is a note from a neighbor, anonymous but neatly printed on cardstock. "We support Cass." I stare at it for a long time. The card is soft between my fingers. Someone took time to design, print, fold, deliver. They believed in the message enough to make it physical. The physicality of accusation matters. It turns gossip into artifact. I pin it to my wall, not as decoration, but as evidence. Paper has a way of keeping its tone long after the event has passed. Mira posts a thread about personal boundaries and emotional labor, quoting scholars and online essays. She calls it a conversation starter about generational entitlement. I recognize the family history she distorts into theory. She talks about me without naming me, transforming years of shared meals and repaired walls into examples of toxic dynamics. Her voice is sharp and ideological and performed. She doesn't mean harm, perhaps, but she means visibility. Visibility is its own form of currency. I watch her thread the way you watch someone else cut a ribbon and expect applause. The likes climb, the retweets multiply, and I realize that a person can sell righteousness the way others sell coffee. At the hardware store, I find calm in repetition. I restock screws, sweep aisles, organize nails by size. The air smells of sawdust and effort. Matteo asks if I've seen the latest post. I tell him I don't follow anymore. "Good," he says. "Nothing grows in poisoned soil." He has a way of talking that turns advice into proverb. We share a quiet hour fixing an old display rack, and the sound of the drill steadies me. Machines obey if you treat them correctly. People are harder. The city moves around us, restless as ever. A development opens a mile away, and rents go up overnight. Families who had roots in the old neighborhood find themselves edged out by fashion and money. That friction sharpens small grievances into moral arguments. Cass thrives in that friction. She converts slights into sermons about boundaries and self-care. She is good at the work of appearing righteous. Her voice fits the times, measured outrage wrapped in humor. Each post adds a coat of polish to her public self. She doesn't notice that the real self beneath it grows thinner. I stop being surprised. I start being tactical. Every silence becomes a strategy, every delay a test. I stop giving free labor and let the unresolved tasks accumulate. The trash that no one takes down begins to smell faintly in the stairwell. The sink drips a steady rhythm. I let it. I let the condo's door that sticks turn into a symbol. Symbols have power in a social life. The stuck door is now a testament to my absence. Each time someone struggles with it, They will think of me, not as a person, but as the missing hand that used to make it work. Weeks pass. I hear through neighbors that Dan and Cass are hiring contractors. They complain about the cost, about how difficult it is to find someone reliable. I smile. Reliability was always the currency I paid them in. Without it, their economy falters. I see Dan once outside the grocery store. He looks tired, thinner around the eyes. "Dad," he says, "can we talk?" I nod, but I don't invite him in. We stand beside the carts, half strangers. "Cass didn't mean to offend you," he says. "She was just venting." I tell him venting is fine as long as it doesn't require an audience. He rubs his forehead, exasperated. "You're taking this too far." I shrug. "Maybe," I say, "but sometimes too far is the only distance that works." He doesn't answer. He doesn't understand that I am not punishing. I am teaching. In the evenings, I review my notes. I draw small diagrams, lines connecting dates and reactions. I begin to see the shape of the story forming, not the one Cass tells, but the one that exists in paper and ink. It's not a story of malice, but of balance. For every task I performed unseen, there is now a moment of silence recorded beside it. I imagine someday leaving the notebook on their doorstep, not as a confrontation, but as documentation. The record of all the invisible work that held their world together, now visible in neat handwriting. Sometimes I hear echoes from their side. Cass posts about learning independence, about how she's discovering the power of doing things for yourself. Her followers applaud her growth. I don't comment. Growth is growth, even when born from neglect. She doesn't realize she's proving my point. People only understand the value of effort when they feel the cost of its absence. At night, when the city quiets, I open the window and let the cold air in. The sounds drift up. A car door, a siren, a distant laugh. The rhythm of life continues without consultation. I sit with that thought. Withdrawal, I've learned, is not the same as isolation. It's a kind of reclamation. I am no longer the background character in someone else's story. The silence I've chosen isn't empty. It's full of the weight of things left undone on purpose. There's a power in refusing to be useful on command. It unsettles people who have built comfort on your compliance. It makes them confront the invisible scaffolding they thought was part of the building. I am that scaffolding, slowly being dismantled piece by piece. When it's gone, the walls will have to stand on their own. Some will, some won't. Either way, the structure will tell the truth. The notebook is nearly full now. The last page holds only a single line. Wait. The word is both instruction and resolution. Waiting is the final act of control. I close the book and rest my hand on the cover. Outside, a wind moves through the alley, lifting old papers and carrying them into the dark. Somewhere, in that same dark, a door sticks, a post goes up, a silence deepens. I let it all happen. I count, and I keep counting. The parking garage had that echo that makes every footstep a sentence. Dan cornered me between two cars, his voice high for a man my son's age. Cass stood with her phone out, recording. She wanted the keys. She wanted my apartment keys in front of witnesses. She wanted me to prove I was nothing more than a source of convenience. "Just give it up, Pop," Dan said. "Make everyone comfortable." He spoke in the smooth, practiced tone of someone who has been coached to be reasonable. The garage light hummed overhead. Cass smiled like a woman who knows her audience. "It would be for safety," she said loud enough for a passerby to hear. "We have kids. Emergencies happen." She placed the phrase emergencies like a coin on the table. The coin glinted under the sterile light. I kept my hands in my pockets. My knee frowned when I shifted my weight. "I don't hand out my house by the pound," I said. My voice was calm and cool like glass. "If you need my help, ask. If you need my apartment, ask for a key like a neighbor, not like you own the place." She raised the phone higher. "You heard him," she said to the screen. People in other cars glanced. For them, the scene was compact against the world. A young couple, a stubborn father, a moment that reads cleanly in status updates. She reached for my wrist and tried to pull the keys from my pocket. Her hand was quick. She wanted the gesture of reclaiming an old authority. I turned and ran, not fast, but purposeful, toward the stairwell. My knee complained. The sound of the steps kept a rhythm with my breath. The stairwell smelled of old cement and laundry soap. I had used that stairwell 100 times bringing groceries up. I can move quietly when I need to. I took the landings 2 at a time until my lungs tightened. Cass's breath followed me, faster and angrier. I could hear Dan's footsteps, stunned and unsteady. At the 3rd landing, I stopped and turned. Cass froze like a child who has been caught trying to take an extra piece of candy. "Don't film me," I said. The stairwell held our words like a jar. She kept recording. "He tried to run," she said into the camera. "He attacked me." The words were precise and designed, as if the sentence had been stitched into the fabric of a future post. A security guard opened a door at the lobby with a flashlight. The man looked at us like a judge and said, "Everything all right here?" His voice was bored with the year's monotony. Cass lifted her chin and said, "He tried to take my phone." She pressed the phone like a talisman. People gather around the foot of the stairs. Neighbors, a delivery man with a box, a young woman walking a dog. I showed my open palms. "Ask the camera," I said. "Ask the stairwell's camera." There was a small black box in the corner and a lens like an eye. The security guard peered through the screen and shrugged. "Keep it civil," he said, and the word had the weight of a dismissal. I left that night through the other door and walked home, thinking about the way cameras and phones have changed everything. A recording is proof if you edit it right. The raw footage is truth if somebody looks. The trick is timing. I walked past the community hardware store and bought a padlock with a keyed cylinder. I paid cash and kept the receipt. Small purchases become witnesses in my ledger. Later, at home, I wrote, "Garage ran stairs." Cass filmed and dated it. The ledger fills with small sentences that, together, will look like a plan. I learn locks and letters. I spend evenings at the hardware store, where the owner, a man named Carlo, talks about hinges like he is talking religion. Carlo knows how the world hangs together and how it can be taken apart. He shows me different lock cylinders and explains, in practical terms, how a property manager handles master keys. He does not teach me to pick locks. He shows me how different locks report entries when they have electronic systems and how the simplest locks are often the most overlooked. I ask questions like a man who is trying to learn enough to be present when something breaks. The information is practical. A landlord's office keeps logs. An apartment building has a paper trail if someone looks for it. Cameras are everywhere now, and someone is always watching. I make small visits to the condo association office. I explain that I used to do repairs and that they can call me. I let them note that I have a history with the building. Little by little, I slip into their memory. One clerk, a young woman who drinks her coffee cold, tells me that the building's security cameras face the lobby and the stairwells. She laughs at Cass's posts once I bring them up. "People love a narrative," she says. "If you make the right narrative, the world will nod." I pay attention to the way emails arrive. I print notices. I save screenshots. Screenshots are fragile if you rely on a single device, so I print copies and staple them into the ledger. People think in terms of likes and comments. I think in terms of timestamps. At night, I go to Coach Walt's gym and work on my hands. Farmer's carries, rope climbs up to the rafters, slow squats, exercises that make my grip certain. Strength gives you options. It makes redirections possible. I am not building myself into a fist. I am building myself into something that moves with purpose. I call an old friend who runs a small printing business and ask him to help me compile a packet. Public posts, dates, text messages, where favors are requested and not repaid, receipts for purchases I made for their household. He agrees, without comment. He is one of those quiet people who knows when a ledger is necessary. When you start collecting, people notice. Anya notices that I come home later than usual. She follows me with her usual gossip and a soft look that is almost pity. I do not mind her pity. It will be useful in a way I cannot yet say. Mira writes about boundaries and the ethics of caretaking in a graduate forum and pins my name to a concept she calls emotional extraction. Her post is clever, and she frames the family history in a language designed to be unassailable. I keep the link. I print it. The ledger is growing like a small legal file. Cass continues to cultivate a brand. She posts staged photos of Dan holding a coffee mug with the words "chosen family" and writes about the exhausting labor of being a wife. She is selective with her images, scenes of tidy countertops, candles, well-lit children playing. The reality that once existed behind those images is more complicated. Social media thrives on simplicity. I take care to never fabricate. My ledger is all things that can be verified. Receipts, screenshots, witnesses. The truth is boring in its fragments, but together those fragments make a pattern. A pattern is hard to deny. I practice the timing of revelations. You can't drop everything at once and expect people to notice the fine details. You scatter them like seeds and then choose the season to harvest. A woman in the building lobby asks me, "Aren't you angry?" I look at her and say, "Anger is a poor craftsman. Patient measures build better structures." She regards me like I've contradicted common sense. She's right. People expect fury. They like a tidy performance. I will not offer that. I will offer something slower and harder to dismiss. The smoke came from an overboiled pan. It happens in apartments. It happens to people who are tired. Sprinklers wet the rug and the old elevator smelled of copper. I guided an elderly neighbor down 3 flights. A supervisor watched from the lobby and later told the story to the building manager. The story had my name in it, and that changed things. Cass had turned the situation into a performance almost immediately. She recorded portions of the hall as she shepherded guests out, like a woman proving her virtue. "I kept everyone calm," she said into the camera, breathless, while he stood by and watched. The clip would run later in slow edits. I insisted on making sure people were out. That was the only real priority among the performance. There was an old man with a cane who told me, "My legs don't go like they used to," and I said, "Then my arms will." I carried his light bag down and walked his slow steps with him. A child clung to a plush toy and refused to leave it. I took the toy and waved it at him until he smiled. The building supervisor, a man named Richard, later told the manager that the old man in 3B had coached people down the stairs. The old man in 3B was me. The manager made a note in a small log that had a weekend mark next to it. Evacuation, assisted tenant. The note was unremarkable, but the date was there. The manager, when asked to describe the event later, used my name. This is the way things accumulate in a bureaucratic world. Cass accused me at the meeting afterward. "He staged it," she said, voice tighter than the scene warranted. "He staged the whole thing to get sympathy." She had an audience in the building association that night. People look at smoke and despair and are ready to place blame if it helps them sleep. I kept my reply simple. "I helped people," I said. "You can post whatever you like." My tone bored into the type of accusation she had been trained to make. Her performance required a villain. I refused to provide one willingly. An email later that week came from Sergei, the event hall manager. He had heard about the building incident from mutual vendors. He wrote that it was good to hear that matters of safety were handled. He mentioned a wedding booking in his note, Cass's wedding. I logged his email. Sergei would become a minor player in the theater I was building. Vendors notice details. They have their own record books. After the fire alarm incident, I started to take pictures of minor repairs I had performed earlier. A door handle I replaced, A socket I had rewired after a sparking incident, a window latch that had been replaced when they complained the lock was stiff. I dated each photo and printed them. The ledger became heavier and more persuasive. It is a peculiar thing when the people who build your life begin to strip away its meaning. People will not see the hours you have given until you stop giving them. Then, they will notice the absence and call it cruelty. But absence can be a lesson. It can teach them to take responsibility. I did not expect the manager to mention the fire alarm in a family forum later. He did, and he signed the post with caution and a simple line. Thanks to those who helped evacuate. Better to be safe. The line had my name attached in the comments. A neighbor forwarded it to me with a note. Good for you. The note was small, but it mattered. There was a name I had been carrying in the notebook, written in block letters. Yuri. Cass had written stories about being abandoned. Public pity was currency for her. I found him working nights, careful and sober, in a machine shop. He had been kept away by a history of accusation and fear. I asked him to come to the wedding if invited, not to perform a reveal, but to be present if truth needed a body. It is an awkward thing to find someone a family has pretended does not exist. You go into the search with a soft shame and come back with facts. Yuri had not disappeared like a ghost. He had worked with metal and had a set of hands that knew how to hold against heat. He smelled of oil and honesty. He had been kept away by a set of accusations and a fear that the law would be cruel. When I first met him, he was surprised that I had called. "Why would you bring me to a place where everyone will be looking at me?" he asked. His English was measured, his answers cautious. "Because there is a history," I said, "because sometimes a presence is more honest than a post." He agreed to attend if invited. He did not want to be a spectacle. I promised him nothing but truth. He said, "Truth is enough." I wrote that down in the ledger. There is a curious thing about the presence of a man who has been called an abandonment. He upends the script. People who had rehearsed pity for Cass now have to reconcile the idea that a man had been around in some shape or form. It does not absolve past harms. It complicates the narrative she had made clean and marketable. I visited Yuri twice. The second time, I brought Coach Walt as a witness. Coach Walt's large presence seemed to make Yuri relax a little. We spoke about the wedding logistics and about how to enter without spectacle. Yuri said, "I will sit in the back and watch." He was steady in the way of men who have learned to be patient with the world. At home, I wrote the name Yuri in large letters in the notebook and circled it. Circling names is ridiculous, but it made me feel as if the idea had a border. Borders matter. In the week before the wedding, I spoke with Sergei, the caterer and hall manager, and arranged a small, simple queue. A particular door would be opened at a particular time. Sergei is a practical man who understands how music and movement make people forget details. He accepted nothing but the usual fee and a request that he keep his staff disciplined. Vendors know how to profit from drama, but they also know the value of a well-run event. They are often the first to notice when a script will fail. I phoned Yuri one more time and told him the time and place. He asked if he should bring anything. "Nothing," I said. "Just bring yourself." He hesitated and then said, "If I come, I will sit where I can be seen, but not forced into light." I agreed. Simple things are often the most radical. Gossip is a lever that can move a mountain of reputation if it's used patiently. Anya, the neighbor, becomes my involuntary distributor. She begins to circulate printed screenshots at the laundromat, copies of Cass's posts, the HOA notice, an image of the ledger with dates visible. She does this not out of malice, but because she likes the moral clarity of a scandal. Someone downsizes their story into a schematic of right and wrong. People pay attention when the schematic has a pattern. My ledger makes a pattern. A pattern is hard to argue against. Dan tries to split the difference. "Dad, Can't we just talk? He asks in a tone that suggests negotiation will solve a moral rift. He is used to smoothing things with numbers and apologies dressed as practicality. He has been taught that optics can be repaired with payments and gestures. I hand him a packet that contains printed copies of HOA notices, the log of repairs, and the email from the building manager. This is not about optics, I say. It is about facts. Mira posts again, this time a lengthy thread about the invisibility of labor. She calls out the moral complexity of caretaking and implies that elders can be unhelpful. Her academic language sounds good in a seminar, but when matched with receipts, it begins to sound selective. People notice when a theorist's claims do not match the ledger in their hands. Cass escalates with the calm of someone who believes the world owes her performance. She tells a cousin that the family is toxic and posts pictures of neat flower arrangements and a cake reading New Beginnings. She is practiced at producing images that are easy to like and cheap to spread. She has learned to monetize pity. I do not respond publicly to her posts. Silence is a strategy. When a person keeps speaking and nobody answers, the social field begins to clear. It is a small victory to create a blank space where someone must explain themselves. People will fill that blank with either their own doubts or their own justifications. A cousin publishes a voice note in which Cass is heard complaining about unpaid labor and calling me a liability. The voice note circulates among relatives like a pointed needle. The relatives begin to pick sides. Some choose Cass for the argument she makes about boundaries. Some choose me because they remember nights when I fixed cars at odd hours or brought casseroles to holiday tables. I never threaten them. Threats are messy and require a readiness to escalate beyond what I want. Instead, I rely on the ledger and on the presence of witnesses. I place small facts in the public field, receipts, timestamps, and the testimony of the building manager. The facts do not bloom immediately into judgment, but they seed questions. Cass's influencer friends notice cracks and begin to ask for clarification in comments. Is this true? They ask. Are you okay? The questions are small, but they are the first interruptions in a curated narrative. I am not cruel. My aim is not to destroy for pleasure. My aim is to restore a sense of fairness. When people have been given a public role in a private life, without the burdens that come with it, a correction is sometimes necessary. It is a brittle task to balance repair and harm. I move carefully. They stood under lights that made everyone look important. Cass took the microphone with a practiced smile. She asked for my apartment keys in front of 100 guests. I said no. She slapped me. The sound of the slap set people like coins falling. There was a moment where the music stopped and the room inhaled. People who had been eating and laughing found their mouths empty. The slap was not hard, it was the meaning that landed. 100 people saw what had been rehearsed into performance suddenly take a sharp turn into reality. She said, "Hand them over." Her voice was bold, the way a performer uses a microphone to make the room lean. "For emergencies," she added, and the phrase was repeated like a charm. I stood at the edge of the room, where the lights dimmed a touch. My heart beat a regular, patient drum. I could have made a speech. I could have raised my voice and called out the hypocrisy. Instead, I pressed a single thumb against my phone and sent one text to the number I had written down weeks ago. Yuri, confirm. It was a small, precise signal. Only the person who knew that number would understand. The hall's doors were long and heavy, painted steel that creaked on hinges. They were meant for people to arrive with drama or exit with haste. I had arranged a small queue with Sergei so that one door would open at exactly the right moment. Cass's face turned when the door moved. People looked. No one expected the man who stepped into the hall. He was older than the pictures that had been hinted at in posts about abandonment. He had a cap on his head and a workman's jacket folded over his broad shoulders. He did not shout or demand anything. He walked in, and the room itself seemed to lean toward him. Not in pity, but in the human attention that appears when someone enters who ought to have been there long ago. Yuri's presence had a practical effect. He did not need to make dramatic statements. He did not need to accuse. He simply looked toward Cass with something that was not performative. The lights in the hall made his face plain. People who had been rehearsing their reactions had to revise them. Cass stood with her microphone in her hand, mouth open. "This is a stunt," she said quickly. Her voice was high with fear and anger. "This is staged." Yuri walked to the small stage and stood beside her as if he had been invited. He did not touch her. He said, "I sent letters." His voice was quiet but steady. "I wrote when I could. I had reasons to stay away. I did not want trouble, but I was there." The hall's mood shifted. Someone at a corner table began to cry, a low, surprised sound. People shifted their chairs like leaves. Dan's face went white. He had not known the man would come. Mira's hand flew to her mouth. Cass tried to keep control. "He left me," she said. Tears formed, performative or real, I could not tell. "He left me and my mother took over and—" The sentence stumbled. The edges of her narrative were fraying in the presence of a man with his own visible history. The room trickled with whispers. Some people hugged one another, as if the world had become intimate for a second. Others reached for their phones. The cameras that had been recording Cass's earlier strike now found a different story to frame. I did not speak into the microphone. I waited until the hall had settled from the first tremors. Then I walked forward and asked the DJ to cut the music. Sergei nodded. He had known long enough to trust the cue. The lights turned sharp and honest. I said, "Ask the building manager about the evacuation." I held up a printed page with the manager's note and the ledger page with dates. I spoke slowly so the microphone would carry the ordinary weight of paper, of time-stamped entries. "Ask what happened that night," I said. "Ask who was there." A woman at the back table muttered, "He helped the old man." Others added small confirmations. The tenor in the room changed from performance to inquiry. Cass's eyes darted to her phone, and I noticed, as if lit, that her hands trembled. The performance had been built on a fragile architecture of absence. Yuri's presence made the architecture rot. She had built a narrative with a missing man as its cornerstone. Now the stone returned and the structure shifted. When someone spoke of reconciliation, I didn't deny it. I only said, "Truth matters." The slogan was plain. It was the kind of line that can be used for charm and for judgment. It does both, depending on the listener. The hall dissolved into a kind of honest chaos. Guests murmured and took sides. A cousin of Cass's insisted loudly that preferences are important and boundaries are sacred. Another relative asked why no one had mentioned that letters had been sent and perhaps never delivered. The debate was messy and human. In the corner, the cake sat on a cart like an island, extravagant and soft. Someone bumped the cart, and a clumsy server jostled a tier. Frosting shuddered. The night had its own momentum now. It had been ignited by a small, precise intervention and was rolling. Receipts ripple. Digital communities recalibrate when a new fact appears. Cass's posts, that had lived alone on the timeline, now found replies with printed images attached. The ledger I had compiled, the manager's note, a grainy but time-stamped image of me evacuating people from the stairwell. The comments multiplied like a pattern of footsteps in snow. Dan's face was in the camera for a week after the wedding. He posted an apology that sounded like a press release. "I didn't want things to be like this," he said. The statement was neat. It read like a man who had been coached about damage control. People pass apologies and measure their heat. Cass went into full spin mode. She recorded a video from the couple's condo, lit carefully, talking about pressure and misunderstanding. Her composure in the video made some sympathetic comments, but also sharpened doubts. People noticed small contradictions between her staged life and the ledger in their hands. Mira stopped posting for a while. Theoretical positions look small when there is a list of time-stamped receipts at hand. She began to write long, apologetic emails to relatives and to some friends. Her academic tone softened into something more human and uncertain. We had small victories that were non-violent and bureaucratic. The HOA fines, once unpaid, became an issue that Dan had to decide to face. It was not a criminal matter, it was money and paperwork. Those are things you can resolve, or you can ignore, and let consequences accrue. Dan chose to pay some of them, but only after messages became public and his name tied to the ledger. The internet had a peak of interest for a week and then settled into the practical concerns of family. People do not love scandal forever. They move on, even if the movement is a grudging step back to the ordinary. I did not seek to destroy them. I sought to make them accept responsibility for the things they used me for. Dan posted a note of appreciation that was brief and slightly formal. It did not satisfy people who had been looking for contrition. It sufficed for others. An aunt called me and said, "You did a good thing." She had tears in her voice. It was not the broad vindication of a courtroom, but it mattered. Social restoration often begins with small acknowledgements. Cass's followers dwindled and changed. The influencer world is a volatile market. When a brand's core narrative is undercut, the brand must pivot or dissolve. She tried to pivot, but authenticity is not something you can manufacture once it has been questioned publicly. In private, the family had fights that were sharp and messy. People said things they could not take back, the kind of sentences that live in a house's memory. Dan accused me of ruining his wedding. I told him I had helped people leave a burning building. He accused me of ruining the brand. I told him branding is not worth a life. There is a peculiar cruelty in being betrayed by the people who owe you the simplest human courtesies. You think they'd have the decency to take your existence into account. When they do not, you choose a response. Mine was measured and slow. The ledger collected the facts like rain in a barrel. We met on the trail because there are places where a man can disappear into night, and other men cannot follow without one telling the story. Dan had an e-bike. I had an old single-speed and a tow rope trick I practiced in the gym with Coach Walt. The trick is simple and legal. It is a matter of physics and timing. He wanted to speak to me alone. He wanted me to fix his life and my street. He wanted me to be available again as before. We both knew what he was asking. He wanted me to be both a father and a service. I told him no. He was not used to no as an answer within the family context. "Come on," he said. "This is small. Hand over the keys and let's move on." I shook my head. "You can move on without my keys." The towpath runs along the river with trees and streetlights spaced like punctuation marks. At night, it is a place where shadows walk and the city hums in the distance. We both rode. He chose speed and a sense of ownership that an e-bike gives. I chose care and a rope tied at the rear of my bike like a jury-rigged bridle. The rope trick is simple. You loop a length of cord through your rear rack and tie a slack bight. When your opponent is in motion and is focused on sprinting forward, a quick release and a touch can redirect momentum without harm. It works because it uses physics instead of force. It works because it is quick and non-violent, but disorienting. Dan misjudged a curve. He accelerated and leaned. The rope caught the front of his path and wrenched his front wheel. He fell into grass with a surprised sound. His phone skittered into the weeds. He was bruised and furious. He picked himself up and raged like a child who had been thwarted. 2 joggers passed us, their faces blank with the smallness of city life. One of them stopped to ask if everything was okay. I said, "Yes, all right here," and he moved on. The trail had a camera at the trailhead, and other joggers had seen the skirmish. Someone later called the police because there was shouting. The police arrived and took our statements. "A mutual warning," the officer said, clipboard in hand. "No charges if nobody presses." That was enough. We were both tired and embarrassed. Dan kept swearing about public disgrace. I told him the only disgrace was his willingness to pretend to be incapable of responsibility until it suited him. We left the towpath, with our skinned palms and our stubborn faces. He demanded the keys again. I handed him a printed packet with the HOA notices and the ledger and said, "Read this. Make choices." He punched the air and swore and left. The rope lay coiled on the back of my bike like a tool put away. Violence had not been my aim. Damage to ego had been. Damage is a legal concept when it injures property. When it injures reputation, it is messier. Messy things do not make for tidy legal outcomes. That is why my method was paper and presence rather than fists. The police had left a trace. An officer had made a note, and then a mutual warning. No one wanted charges. Dan wanted options, and he didn't like the options I offered. I wanted to make them choose between accountability and convenience. I called a meeting for later that night at the hall, where they had the small private room they used for toasts and speeches. I asked Sergei to open it and arranged for a neutral witness, Coach Walt, to be present. I brought the printed packet with receipts and the ledger. "These are your choices," I said, setting the packet down like a carpenter places tools. "Return my keys and start paying your own fines, publicly retract the lies about abandonment, and stop representing my work as your own. Or you can face the consequences of not complying, continued public exposure, and legal responsibility for unpaid fines." It was a clean set of choices. People panic when given a choice they never expected to face. When their public performance requires you to be available at every hour, they must decide if they can afford that kind of maintenance. Cass looked at the packet like a woman who is being asked to choose between the truth and her brand. She huffed and said, "Or what?" "Or I will unmask the narrative in public," I said. "I will present the receipts and the people who remember what actually happened." The idea of truth in public made her face set like someone about to speak an incantation. Dan picked up the packet and thumbed through it like a man skimming a book he does not want to buy. "This is petty," he said. His voice had the brittle sound of someone who is losing control. "Petty," I said. "It is the only way to make you feel the labor you have been taking for granted." He slammed the packet down like a child who believes a slam is enough to close a subject. "I won't be blackmailed in my own life. This is my wedding night. We will not be humiliated. You may choose humiliation, or you may choose to accept responsibility," I said. "Both are real choices." A distant siren threaded through the air like a reminder that we live inside a city with other people's emergencies. Choices are often dressed in illusion. I wanted the reality. I wanted to see what they would do when the clocked moments pushed them. In the end, they refused my terms. They walked out of the room with a slam of doors and a promise to fight. It is a strange thing to watch a family fight over a set of paper choices. It looks melodramatic to an outsider and intimate to those in it. Legalities are clumsy here. The family is its own jurisdiction. I left the hall and walked the city blocks and thought about what it means to refuse to play a part. The city slept with its lights on in certain living rooms and the darkness in others. The night smelled of fried bread and autumn. I felt the ledger heavy in my bag. It is a peculiar weight to carry the truth. It is a heavier thing to carry a family that refuses to see it. At the end, the room brightened, and the video projector clicked on. Photographs of a man and a small girl, dates on the corner of the frames, ran across the wall. Yuri stood as the images played, and the story rearranged itself in people's heads. Sergei had agreed to run the images without commentary. They spoke for themselves. They showed a man with a small child at a park, the date printed in the corner, a note in the margin from a relative who had apparently tried to forward letters. Each image sounded like a clock ticking down the time of a truth. Cass's expression changed from defiance to an animal's confusion. Her hands trembled. The room, which had been full of chatter, went quiet in that way. A room goes quiet when music cuts out. I walked forward. The cake cart sat to the side. a small island of frosting and plates. The cart had wheels like a small cart of law. Someone had been careless, and the cart was near an edge of the floor where people had been dancing. I took a step and the cart tipped. It was not planned, though I had agreed with Sergei on the lighting. A server bumped the cart in a flustered move, and the top tier wobbled and folded into the bottom in a slow, absurd ruin. The crash of cake into cake made a sound like a small avalanche. People laughed and cried and recorded with their phones. Cass lunged at the cart as if to rescue her moment. She lost her balance and stumbled against a side table. Plates rattled. Someone nearby swiped a glass of champagne toward the floor. The room was a mosaic of human reaction, raw and messy. Dan tried to step between Cass and the moment, to claim control. He extended a hand toward me, and anger drove his face like wind pushing a sail. He spoke a sharp sentence and made a step that looked like it wanted to be collision. I moved with the muscle memory I had built over weeks in Coach Walt's gym. I sidestepped and used a hip motion to redirect him into an empty chair. He fell into it with a curse that sounded like a small animal. No one was hurt. That was the point. The physics of the move were such that it redirected momentum instead of breaking bodies. People noticed the difference between retribution and violence. The room had the taste of a confrontation that stayed precise. I walked to the microphone and set the packet down on the small lectern. I didn't shout. I never do. My voice has always been for explaining, for naming a thing calmly. I will not be your handyman, your alibi, or your punching bag, I said. The sentence landed with a quiet thud, like a tool set on wood. My voice did what it needed to do. It reframed the situation without melodrama. Yuri stood in the doorway and looked at Cass with a strange softness. He did not touch her. He said, "I was there in letters. I was there in attempts to reach." His English was not perfect, but it did not need to be. Presence is its own language. Guests ranged from shocked to relieved. Some cried. Some put their phones together as if forming a small altar. People often seek ceremony in the middle of chaos. It helps them understand what happened. Those are the human attempts at making sense of entropy. Cass sat down on the floor at one point, her dress askew. She cried in a way that sometimes seems to be real and sometimes is performative. It is not my place to pass grief when it is so close to anger. People are complex. They hold contradiction in their bones. Dan swore and ran an errand to collect his composure. Mira watched with a hand over her mouth, and then, after a pause, she walked toward me. She did not say anything sharply. She placed her hand on the packet and then on my shoulder with a small, hesitant pressure. "You were right about the ledger," she said in a voice that was almost a whisper. She didn't look self-satisfied. She looked tired. I turned and walked to the door. My footsteps were measured. The hall was in a state of recovery, like a bird whose nest had been poked and then mended. People would talk about this evening for weeks. They would produce versions. Memory is a business, and each person keeps receipts. Outside, the night had a wind that moved leaves against the street. The city smelled of fried bread and distant rain. I pressed my palm to the cold metal of the door and felt it reverberate like a note in a bell. I had set things in motion, and I had chosen not to hurt. I had chosen to make them choose. The door slammed behind me with the kind of finality that happens in small domestic dramas when someone decides a story is closed. I stepped into the cold air and let the sound of the hall collapse behind me. The lights were too bright and the room fell away. I stepped out, chest tight, and the night accepted me today.